All right. Chapter 9. I was going to do the whole chapter, but now I'm not. Zechariah 9 is, well, I said it a couple times in the previous chapters that Zechariah 9 is kind of my favorite. It's not my favorite because it's more profound or it's more God's word than any other portion of Scripture. It's just, I'm kind of a history buff, and if you're not a history buff, you're going to be real bored tonight. But if you are, you're going to be really enthralled, I think. It's just amazing. And the layers of fulfillment found here are just a perfect example of what we've been talking about through the prophecies of Zechariah in the near fulfillment, the far fulfillments, and all the things that we've seen. And we're going to see that throughout the rest of the book as well. As we look at these prophecies of Zechariah, what we're also going to see is that what we've seen all through the Bible as we've went through Esther and Ruth and all of the narrative sections of historical genre in the Bible, that God is in control of all of history. And He will accomplish His word. He will accomplish His promises. They are trustworthy. And there is, though we doubt it quite often, we don't see how it can happen. We don't see how it's possible. God will always be faithful to His word, and His word will always come to pass. But once again, we need to remember that when we read prophetic literature, whether it's Zechariah, Joel, Ezekiel, even Isaiah, and all of these major prophets and the minor prophets, we can't read it like we're reading a narrative story in the gospel. God's prophecies often bounce back and forth from near fulfillment to far fulfillment, from fulfillment to what is happening to the people that the prophecy is given to, and even to fulfillment ultimately at the end of the age in the new heavens and the new earth. So whenever people take prophecies like this, and especially the prophecies we're going to see in 10, 11, 12 of Zechariah, 13, 14, if we take those prophecies as a newspaper article, an investigative report of facts that are going to happen in a certain order, errors are made in a lot of places when we do that. We have to understand the layers of fulfillment. It had meaning and it had true fulfillment for the people who first heard it. It had meaning and true fulfillment in Christ and the gospel, and it has meaning and true fulfillment to come in the future kingdom when all things are made new. And we need to recognize that, or otherwise we get, this prophecy seems to conflict with that prophecy, seems to conflict with that prophecy. Many people have, I said prophetic telescoping last time. You probably have not heard that term, but you probably have seen the mountain diagram, haven't you? The prophets looked across the mountains and they didn't necessarily see the valleys, but they saw the mountaintop of how this is going to be filled. And then they saw the mountaintop of Christ and His coming, the King's coming. And then they saw the mountaintop of the future kingdom when all is made new. And they didn't always put that in okay, this is going to happen first, then this is going to happen, then this is going to happen. They just gave what they saw as God gave this vision. And we're going to see that illustrated all the way through the rest of this book, even in the second half of chapter 9. In Zechariah 9, 1 through 8 is what we're going to do tonight. What we see is the judgment of the enemies of God's people and the protection and salvation of God's people. Then in 9 through 17, which we'll look at next week, we're going to see the coming of the king, riding on a donkey into Jerusalem. And then right after that, he starts talking about when the kingdom's going to be established and there won't be any more war and there won't be any more. So you see even there, the first coming of Christ, and then right after it, we're talking about the second coming when all is made new. And so in both sections, the first half, second half of Zechariah 9, we see these layers of fulfillment ultimately pointing to the consummation, the kingdom, and the glory to come. But, as I said, we're only going to examine verses 1 through 8 tonight because there is so much to see in these verses. And it's really amazing, and I enjoy it. So let me enjoy it. Okay, so here Zechariah prophesies the judgment that's going to fall on several cities who oppose God's people. Seen that many times through Old Testament scriptures. Now, let's read 1 through 8. We'll just read the whole 1 through 8, and then we'll come back and look at it. It says this: The oracle of the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach, and Damascus is its resting place. For the Lord has an eye on mankind. If you have an NIV, it says something much different right there. And on all the tribes of Israel. And on Hamath also, which borders on it. Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise, Tyre has built herself a rampart or a fortress, and heaped up silver like dust, and fine gold like the mud of the streets. But behold, the Lord will strip her of her possessions and strike down her power on the sea, and she shall be devoured by fire. Talking about the city of Tyre. And then the Philistine cities that are further south. It says Ashkelon will see it. They'll see Tyre's destruction and will be afraid. Gaza too, and shall writhe in anguish. Ekron also, because its hopes are confounded. I can't really read that screen. The king shall perish from Gaza. Ashkelon shall be uninhabited. A mixed people shall dwell in Ashdod. And I will cut off the pride of Philistia. Those 4 cities are all traditionally Philistine territory. I will take away its blood from its mouth, the Philistines, and its abominations from between their teeth. It too shall be a remnant for our God. It shall be like a clan in Judah, and Ekron shall be like the Jebusites. Then I will encamp at my house as a guard, so that none shall march to and fro. No oppressor shall again march over them, for now I see with my own eyes. So that is the prophecy of basically judgment raining down upon mostly the cities there in the Promised Land. Zechariah prophesies that God's going to judge all of these cities that were opposed to God's people. Now, if you notice in that list of cities, Hadrach is kind of a region. The rest are cities there. There's no mention of kind of some traditional enemies of the Jews, like Edom or Moab or the Ammonites. There's several that are kind of left out in there. And that's because their territories were east of the Dead Sea and not in the Promised Land. Here God is foretelling the destruction of the enemies, and it's like his judgment is marching from north to south down to each of these cities that are actually in the land of promise. And in fact, they were the ones that troubled Judah the most as they were rebuilding. So first, let me show you where these places were in the time period. Now, on this map, I hope you can see it. Can y'all see that? Pretty good. I kind of put arrows everywhere so you know exactly where the city was, because you really can't see the dots and all that. So this map is actually a map of the land during the time of Jeroboam. So it's not exactly accurate as to the borders. Let's see here. If I could do this, and actually at the time that we're talking about, the border would look like something like this. Except you can't see that. Hang on. I got a thing here. I planned ahead. All right, here we go. The border would look something like this. Can you see that? What the heck? All right. I guess that's not going to work. No. Watch this. I'm going to do it. It's going to get done right here. If you can't do it, you just shut it down, restart it. Everything works. Okay. I'm going to try it one more time. If it don't work now, I'm just going to leave it. All right. Yeah, there you go. That's kind of what it would look like, because you see this lower corner that's off color. This is Edom. This is Moab. Now, all of this is during the time of Jeroboam, so this is hundreds of years before Zechariah is prophesying. It was before the exile. But it was a map that I found that give you the location kind of these cities. And so in this, on this map, you can kind of see the cities that Zechariah's prophesying about. It just kind of give you a perspective of where they are. And it's as if the judgment in line, it goes, now Hadrach is nowhere else mentioned in Scripture. In fact, a lot of people thought that it didn't exist and the Bible was wrong until they found some documents from Assyria that talked about the land of Hamath that was the land of Hadrach that was north of Hamath. So Hadrach is going to be up off the screen somewhere. Then you have Hamath, and then Damascus, and then Tyre and Sidon, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gaza. And then, of course, Jerusalem is further to the west. But it's like the way he describes these cities, judgment is coming down from the north, and it's hitting all of those cities. And we'll see that as we read more closely. Judgment's kind of coming down, working its way down the coast. And so in verse 1 and 2, I already told you about Hadrach. I already told you that. Hadrach and Hamath at the top were kind of out of the border of what was the promised land from ancient Israel. Kind of the frontier of Syria. And Hamath is on the eastern side of the Orontes River, which is one of the promised northern boundaries of Israel. And of course, Damascus is the key city. That's what it told us in that first verse. It says, the oracle of the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach. Remember, that's way up north. Damascus is its resting place, the kingdom of Syria. And then, for the Lord has an eye on mankind. The Lord has an eye on mankind and all the tribes of the... Where is Hamath? Did I miss that? Oh, no, there it is. Lord has eye on mankind and all the other tribes of Israel, and on Hamath also, which borders it, Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise. That's verse 1 and 2. And so it says, Damascus, the key city of the northern territory. During this time, Damascus served as the seat of the Persian governor of that province, the Trans-Euphrates province in the Persian Empire. And notice here, before we move on with the judgment and the map and all that stuff, it says the eyes of the Lord are on mankind and all the tribes of Israel. Anybody have a different translation? What does it say? Yeah, he said the eyes of all humanity, especially the tribes of Israel, are on the Lord. But here it says, in the ESV, it says the Lord has his eye on mankind and all the tribes of Israel. There was good arguments as far as, I'm not a Hebrew grammarian, but there was good arguments from the grammar, both 2 and 4. But I think the Lord has his eye on the tribes of Israel and all mankind kind of fits the context better. So that's what I think. I'm not dying on that hill or anything. But the fact that the eyes of the Lord are on the tribes of Israel, or maybe the tribes of Israel's eyes are on the Lord, that's an amazing statement. Because when the prophets talk about Israel and Judah, who are they talking about? I mean, I know they're talking about God's people, but remember, after Solomon, the nation split into two kingdoms. Remember? Northern, southern. The northern one was called what? Israel, or Ephraim sometimes. And it was made up of how many tribes? 10 tribes, exactly right. And the southern was called Judah, sometimes called Benjamin, and it was made up of those two tribes. Now, we've been talking all through Zechariah about the Jews coming back from Babylon when Persia took over and let them go. But the northern kingdom, Israel, in opposed to Judah, was taken into captivity by Assyria 100 years before Babylon ever came against Jerusalem. They were exiled way before Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. Northern kingdom, these 10 tribes, at this point in history, as they're rebuilding city, they're nothing but a memory. But God says that his eyes are still upon the lost and dispersed tribes as well as all of mankind. And he means when my eye is upon them, and we've seen that several times in Zechariah, it can either mean for salvation or for judgment. He means I know what's going on. So judgment starts in the north. He says Hadrach Hamath. Then he goes from Tyre and Damascus and Tyre and Sidon. And the next cities mentioned, he kind of singles out the city of Tyre. And so in verse 3 and 4, he says, Tyre has built herself a rampart, a fortress, and heaped up silver like dust and fine gold like the mud of the streets. But behold, the Lord will strip her of her possessions and strike down her power on the sea, and she shall be devoured by fire. So Tyre is singled out because of its reputation. So its reputation, Tyre was a city that was on an island about a half a mile off the mainland. The old city of Tyre is on the mainland. It was destroyed, and they built new city of Tyre, I guess, on the little island about a half mile off the coast, and it was a fortress. It was 150-foot walls. It was virtually impregnable. In fact, when Assyria, hundreds and hundreds of years later, before, had come to conquer all of the north, they besieged the city of Tyre for 5 years and never conquered it. They never fell. And then 100 years later, when Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon came down to the land and wreaked havoc all over the land, ultimately destroying Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city as well in the early 6th century, and the city held out for 13 years and was never conquered because of that half-mile distance between the island and the mainland. So that is why setting up a siege never worked. Tyre was an island on the coast, and Tyre grew rich through their sea trading. And so a siege, you know what a siege is? Really, when you just surround it, nothing comes in, nothing goes out, and you just starve them out until they give up. It never worked. They just waited behind their 150-foot walls, and the whole time ships were coming and going and dropping off food and all this kind of stuff. They were a hub of sea trading, and they made lots and lots of money doing it. In fact, verse 3 describes Tyre's wealth as being as abundant as the dust on the floor or the mud in the streets. As easy as you could collect mud, they were collecting gold and silver. But here in verse 4, God says he'll destroy the city. He'll remove their power or their wealth. That word can be translated either way. And he'll remove that wealth that they amassed from the sea, from their sea trading. Now, that's impossible. Assyria couldn't do it. Babylon couldn't do it. Yet this is what God promises the people of Israel, or Judah, back in the land, that's going to happen. I'm going to destroy that city. Now, we're going to continue reading in Zechariah as the judgment of God continues south toward the cities of the Philistines and into Gaza. But before we get to that, I want to show you the near fulfillment of how God brought this about. Okay? Okay? Okay. I told you, I'm having a great time. I don't know about y'all, but about 150, 160 years later, after Zechariah made this prophecy, God prophesied through Zechariah, a young man from Macedonia, king of Macedonia, named Alexander, began a 10-year campaign, a conquest in which he conquered most of the known world. He marched all the way to India, defeating the Persians before, in right up towards India, his troops refused to go on. They wanted to return home. They'd been at war for 10 years. And the accounts of Alexander's military practices and his strategies are incredible. I'd encourage you to go read about it. He used, this is not part of the Bible study. This is just stuff I love. He used the phalanx against a vastly superior Persian army. And he beat him. Now, Alexander's not a role model. He was not a moral guy. He was not a good guy at all. But I want you to see the route, because when he came across from Macedonia, he went down into the promised land all the way to Egypt, conquered it, came back up, and then continued on through Persia. So here's the map of the city that we looked at, cities in the line of God's judgment coming down through. And here's Alexander's route through the city, through the Holy Land. So he conquered all along the east coast. He went, my little thing stops there, but he went all the way down to Egypt, all the way to the city of Egypt, conquered Egypt, then came back up, stopped at Jerusalem, and then went all the way out and continued on his conquest of Persia. It was Alexander the Great who destroyed Tyre, where so many others had failed, the Assyrians, Babylons. In fact, it's so ingenious, it's studied today as military strategy, the way that he defeated Tyre. So remember, Tyre's strength came from the fact that it was a fortress and had big walls just like a lot of other cities did, but it was a half mile off the coast. So what he did was he took the ruin and the rubble from the old city and he built a causeway and he marched his army right across it. It says, this is a quote from Richard Phillips, it says, Alexander built a massive causeway from the shore to the island using stones, wood, and the rubble from the old city to create a land bridge a half mile long. The city that had seemed impregnable fell to the young conqueror in just 7 months. They held out for 13 years against Babylon. Fulfilling this prophecy, he's talking about Zechariah's prophecy here, her wealth was taken and the city was consumed by fire. And so Alexander, the wealthy, invincible city that had withstood the largest, fiercest armies that the world had ever known, except Persia, they hadn't conquered them, it was destroyed, just as God foretold. And here is kind of a picture of the causeway that Alexander built. This is a half mile across the ocean here. He took the rubble from the old Tyre and he just had his army build that, and they marched right across to the city and they surrounded the city and besieged the city, ultimately conquering it and burning it to the ground. Took all their wealth, took all their stuff. So this city that couldn't be defeated, God prophesied 150 years earlier would be defeated. And it came to pass as Alexander the Great passed down through here, conquering. And here's a picture of the causeway in 1934. That little bridge stayed there. He didn't pick it back up. And you can see the sand kind of accumulating over the bridge. And it was that way for a long time. And here's the picture of it today. The city just kind of moved. This Lebanon is where the city just kind of moved all the way out into the island. It's pretty amazing, don't you think? That God used pagan. Now, Alexander the Great was used by God in a lot of ways. He spread Greek culture. All of the things. He spread the common language of Greek, which is also what our New Testament scriptures were written in. It was kind of the business language, the common language everyone spoke, so that the scriptures would go out, and the New Testament scriptures would go out, and no matter what country you're from, no matter if you lived in this Greek culture, you could read the scriptures of God. So God's promise to destroy Tyre, given 150 years earlier, was fulfilled as Alexander conquered Persia. Now, back to the text. He conquered Tyre and Sidon, and then it says, Ashkelon shall see it. Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, Ashdod are 4 of the 5 cities of the Philistines. So Ashkelon shall see it and be afraid. Gaza too, and shall writhe in anguish. Ekron also, because its hopes are confounded. The king shall perish from Gaza. Ashkelon shall be uninhabited. And so the sacking and burning of Tyre did send shockwaves down the coast of the Promised Land. Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, Ashdod, I already told you they're Philistine cities. And when Tyre was burned to the ground, something that could not ever happen, when it was burned to the ground, they were so terrified of Alexander that Ashkelon and Ekron submitted to him without any resistance at all. They just opened up the gates and said, "We surrender." They were terrified. Gaza tried to resist, but it only took 5 months of siege for Alexander to cause the city to fall. And once Gaza was defeated, here it says, the king shall perish from Gaza. Alexander ordered the king of Gaza, his name was Battus. He ordered him seized, bound, and he bound him to his chariot and dragged him through the streets of the city until he died. So again, God's prophecy comes true. Alexander also put thousands of people in Gaza to death, and he sold the rest into slavery. It was a city that was destroyed. But then Zechariah's prophecy really takes a surprising turn. So in 6b, really, and 7, he says, "A mixed people shall dwell in Ashdod, and I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. I will take away its blood from its mouth and its abominations from between its teeth. It too shall be a remnant for our God. It shall be like a clan in Judah, and Ekron shall be like the Jebusites. So first of all, blood and the abominations of their mouths refer to these idolatrous practices that the Philistines did, in which they ate blood of the animals they sacrificed, and usually it was combined with idolatry because they were worshiping false gods. God says, I will remove all these wicked practices from them, and he says these Philistines, will be a remnant for God. God will bring them to himself, and they will be people of God, like a clan in Judah. He says the Philistines will be a remnant like a clan in Judah, meaning that the people, they'll be his people. And then he compares Ekron, the city, to the Jebusites. Anybody know who the Jebusites were? Huh?
They were inhabitants of Jerusalem.
They were inhabitants of Jerusalem before it was known as Jerusalem. And when David took the city, the people there were, over time, incorporated into Israel during the period of David and Solomon. So he's saying they will be incorporated into my people. They'll be the remnant will be like a clan in Judah, and Ekron will be like the Jebusites were. And so here is where the link to Alexander's fulfillment of the prophecy, it doesn't completely fulfill this. There is no record whatsoever of the transformation of the Philistines becoming Israelites. Not during this time. The Philistines as a people didn't disappear from history until the time of the Maccabees, about 160 BC. So what we're looking at here, even in the midst of a near fulfillment, this coming conqueror coming down the east coast of the land, destroying cities, what we're looking at here is a time in the future when nations are incorporated into God's people, when these pagans who eat blood and abomination and worship idols are incorporated into God's people. Now, some see, and this may have merit, I'm not sure, some see a partial fulfillment in Acts chapter 8, verse 40. That's when Philip brought the gospel. First, he brought the gospel to the Ethiopian, the story where Philip meets the Ethiopian. And then it says God took him away, and he went through these cities all the way to Caesarea. One of the cities was called Azotus. And you won't find Azotus on the map anywhere because it was renamed Ashdod. It was the ancient city of Ashdod, renamed Azotus, and then in the 1950s, when the Jews came back and were given their state, they renamed it again, Ashdod again. Y'all with me? Yes. Now that might be a hint of a fulfillment, I'm not sure, but ultimately the fulfillment of this, they becoming the nations, becoming the people of God, it can really only be fulfilled totally and completely in that great multitude that no one can number from every nation standing before the throne of God. Are with me? Yes. So there may have been some fulfillment in there that we're not sure of happening, but we know that there's coming a day when they will be people of God, all the Gentiles who profess Christ. Now that last verse in that section, well, then the last verse that we're going to look at, and I know you're thinking, wow, we're going to get done early. Probably not. This last verse in this section shows that as the judgment proceeds down through the land by Alexander's conquest, God will protect his people. He says then, judgment, destruction, the king's killed. He says, then I will encamp at my house as a guard, so that none shall march to and fro, no oppressor shall again march over them, for now I see with my own eyes. Meaning I'm watching over my people. God will encamp around his house. Now, this is one place where I don't like the ESV's translation of so that none shall march to and fro. The NIV says, I will encamp at my house to guard it from marauding forces. Literally, the New American Standard Bible takes this literally, which is, kind of a word for word. It says, I will encamp at my house as a guard because of him who passes by and returns. Who was that? It was Jesus. It was Alexander who passed by destroying cities, went all the way to Egypt, conquered Egypt. He stayed there for a little bit, and then he came back up, and that's when he stopped at Jerusalem. So Alexander went all the way down, and then he came back. He did not stop at Jerusalem when he was on his destruction path all the way down to Egypt, but he did stop at Jerusalem when he came back up and continued his campaign out into Persia. Anyone know the story? It's kind of a famous story of what happened when Alexander came to Jerusalem. Nobody? Maybe it's a little obscure. You probably may not have heard it. Now, historically, I'm going to tell you what the historian Josephus said happened, but a lot of people don't believe that's true. So, historically, what we know for sure, the only thing we know for sure is that Alexander left Jerusalem alone. And he didn't attack it, he didn't plunder it, he didn't do any harm to any people in it. That's what we know for sure. The historian Flavius Josephus, in his work called The Antiquities of the Jews, where he just writes a history of the Jewish people, he writes an account that is incredible. He says that as Alexander approached Jerusalem, the high priest, his name was Jaddua at the time, he was terrified because of all this destruction that had happened, and he prayed to God, and in a dream, God told him not to fear, but to open up the gates and go out to meet Alexander. So the high priest put on his high priestly robes, all the priests put on their linen garments, and many of the people of the city came out dressed in white to receive Alexander. And as he approached, he saw this scene, and when he saw the high priest, he said that back in Macedonia, before his campaign ever started, he had had a dream, and in that dream he saw this high priest dressed in these clothes, and the priest promised Alexander in his dream that he would conquer Persia. So let me read to you. This is an excerpt from Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, and there's the marker if you want to go look it up yourself. It's 11334. I don't know if they call those chapters or sections or whatever, but this is Alexander speaking as Josephus recounts it. He says, "For I saw," the reason why I'm not destroying this city, whatever, "for I saw this very person in a dream in this very habit," meaning these clothes that he's wearing, "when I was at Dion in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, he exhorted me to make no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea thither, for that he would conduct my army and would give me the dominion over the Persians." He says that as he came, Josephus says that as Alexander came, it was a dream given by God to the high priest and a dream given by Alexander before it ever started that showed him this particular high priest that caused him to not destroy the city. And then Josephus says the high priest took Alexander into the temple and showed him the prophecy of the book of Daniel. And Alexander saw himself as the Greek conqueror that would go forth conquering, prophesied, and he left the city alone, left them in good faith, and went on about his campaign. Now, like I said, many people don't believe that, and that this account is historical, and it may not be. It was written by Josephus in like 93 AD, so it's a long time later that it was written. And there's no other evidence anywhere of this event taking place. And please don't go thinking that Alexander was somehow converted or worshiped Yahweh. He was a pagan through and through, even thinking of himself as the son of Zeus. And then when he was in Egypt, he called himself the son of Ra, or they called him the son of Ra. So we can't corroborate Josephus' testimony. But what we can't deny is that at the time when all these other major cities of the region were ravaged and destroyed and subverted as they surrendered, Jerusalem suffered no loss whatsoever. God watched over his people. However, once again, this prophecy in verse 8, "Then I will encamp at my house as a guard, so that none shall, to keep it from marauding armies, no oppressor shall again march over them, for now I see with my own eyes." That can't be completely fulfilled in Alexander's sparing the city of Jerusalem. Zechariah says never again would an oppressor pass over the Lord's city. And that didn't come to pass after Alexander. When Alexander died, his kingdom was split in between his 4 top generals. And one of those generals' descendants, his name was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He was the Seleucid king of Syria that caused great suffering and turmoil among the Jews in Jerusalem. He oppressed them. He introduced the cult of Zeus into the temple, into the inner parts of the temple, and even sacrificed a pig on the Jewish altar in 167. You can imagine how they felt about that. He was the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy of the abomination that causes desolation standing in the temple, defiling it. And because of this Seleucid king's actions in the temple, a family known as the Maccabees revolted, waged a guerrilla warfare against him, and eventually defeated him. They cleansed the temple and dedicated it once again to the Lord. And that victory is still celebrated today in a Jewish festival called Hanukkah. Yeah, it's Festival of Lights. Hanukkah is actually, the word means dedication. But that's what they're celebrating. When they celebrate Hanukkah, they're celebrating the victory of the revolt of the Maccabees to destroy the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes and rededicate the temple. And then after the Maccabees, I know this is like a history lesson, and I'm enjoying it, so after the Maccabees defeated the Seleucids, there was, it was almost a century of freedom and peace. And then along came another exceptional military leader in 63 BC that conquered the region all over again. You know what his name was? Anybody know? It was what? No, Titus was in 70 AD. In 63 BC, Pompey came and conquered Judah for Rome. And they ruled over the land until well after the time of Jesus. So once again, we have near fulfillment, we have far fulfillment. You see it? God protected the city from Alexander, whether by miracle or by just providence. But this prophecy of permanent and perfect protection, no longer will ever again an army destroy or oppress the people of God. It shows a fulfillment on a scale that the nation has never really experienced. The people of God had never really experienced. In that day, in the fulfillment of this prophecy, no oppressor, whether Alexander or Caesar or any, will transgress God's holy place. On that day, the New Jerusalem will be God's dwelling place, and there will be no rebels, no wickedness, no warlords. There will be peace and permanent salvation. And it all begins with this king who comes riding on a donkey. And that's verse 9. We'll pick that up next week. I guess we are going to get done early. Any questions? Yes.